Resuming debate, please do debate. The Honourable Member for Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour to rise to speak at second reading to Bill C-5. But I wish I never had to speak to the bill, because I wish I'd never had to read the bill. And reading it and understanding it has been one of the most crushingly depressing experiences I've had since I was first elected to this place in 2011. As the Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona quoted a noted journalist, Althia Raj, as saying this is the kind of bill Stephen Harper would have liked to bring forward, but he wouldn't have had the nerve. This is an abomination, and it is not necessary in the quest for building a strong Canadian economy. It doesn't remove the interprovincial barriers to the extent they need to be removed, because that's not within the federal government's purview to do with the stroke of a pen. But it says it's going to. It's going to remove some of the barriers where the federal government can, and then the next part of the bill, which is rather a separate bill and should have been dealt with separately, Part 2, is an entirely different construct, and unlike anything I've ever seen before in legislation. So let's try to walk through this calmly, dispassionately, and urge that the government rethink the way in which this bill is being rammed through Parliament within 4 days. That is not defensible. The bill requires amendments, it requires study, and although I've heard many members in this place, Liberals, stand up and including the government House Leader, say, we want it studied. Well, if you want it studied, you have to schedule hearings. They can't take place in less than 24 hours and call them hearings that heard from witnesses and experts. The programming motion is as offensive as the bill itself, and that's actually saying quite a lot about it. I've been struggling with trying to decide which adage does this bill really prove? Haste makes waste, or the road to hell is paved with good intentions, because both are undoubtedly true. Nous avons ici un projet de loi.
We have an unbelievable bill before us with powers for the Cabinet and Prime Minister alone, without any obligations. It's just their idea.
Part 1 is the one part that's getting the least attention. When I read it, I thought, well, labor mobility is a good thing, and I've been railing for years about the need to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers, particularly for creating an east-west, north-south electricity grid. That's something we desperately need in the quest for climate action. There are things we need to do across this country to make us a truly modern, industrialized nation, and living up to the calls to justice for the missing and murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission of Inquiry. They said we must have safe, reliable, affordable public transportation across this country. We've lost bus service, and Via Rail is inconsistent. That's a true nation-building project. That is actually Pierre Berton's national dream, kind of nation-building project. But we don't need to start out by saying in Part 1 that we know what we're doing, and we're in such a hurry that it's important that we run the risk of reducing standards that protect health and the environment. I was called up short when I got an email from the Canadian Cancer Society, because my initial response to reading Part 1 was, well, I don't have to worry about Part 1. Labor mobility is a good thing. Harmonizing standards is a good thing. It wasn't until I read the Canadian Cancer Society's memo that I remembered how getting rid of regulations in the UK under Margaret Thatcher led to mad cow disease. Because all that red tape, all those things that seemed meaningless, actually protect health and protect environment. Getting rid of regulations just to get rid of them isn't very smart, as during the mad cow horrors of the UK, they realized. What we have in Part 1, which is identified by the Canadian Cancer Society, is the idea of comparable standards, which aren't defined, and saying if there are standards that are exercised at a provincial or territorial level, those can be adopted for goods that are in commerce, and even if they're weaker than the federal standard. So again, the Canadian Cancer Society asks us as parliamentarians to exercise some caution and amend this so that we have a carve-out for health and environmental standards so that they won't be weakened. As businesses looking for profits, of course, are looking for a weaker standard if it helps them make more money. That's the way business works. It's just the reality. You don't want to put in place and incentivize a race to the bottom. So part one is getting a lot less attention, so I wanted to stress the Canadian Cancer Society's concerns. Part two, and again, part one and part two should have been split. They don't have enough in common to be treated as a single bill. I appreciate the Bloc Québécois efforts to get these two quite separate bills decoupled. That won't happen as we're rushed to finish everything within 4 days. Just moments ago, it was referenced that we will have a committee study starting tomorrow afternoon for a bit, and then again Wednesday. The committee to study this bill is one committee, and that committee on transport and communities and infrastructure means that this bill, with profound implications for the environment and Indigenous rights, will never be studied by the Committee on the Environment and Sustainable Development, nor by the Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, nor by the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. What Part 2 does say is that there will be a decision by Cabinet about what project qualifies as being in the national interest. There is a definition of national interest if you want to find it, but it's entirely a tautology. A national interest project means one the Cabinet has decided is a national interest project. If you're looking to see what will lead to the decision that it's a national interest project, we've been, and I'm sure unintentionally, many members in this place have stood up and said, well, don't worry, because they must meet all these factors, and then that's certainly going to be a good project. The factors listed in Section 6 are good factors, and if they were requirements before a project was listed in the national interest, I'd have an entirely different view of this Act. But it says in Section 6 that the Cabinet may consider any factor the Cabinet thinks is relevant, including the extent to which the project can, and then they're the factors that I guess are here for public relations benefit, strengthen Canada's autonomy, provide economic or other benefits, have a high likelihood of successful execution, advance the interests of Indigenous peoples, and contribute to clean growth and to meeting Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. All of that means exactly nothing. Exactly zero. Because it's a suggestion that Cabinet may want to consider anything Cabinet may want to consider. They may want to consider some of these things, but they don't have to. And that's a question of just considering them. I've never seen anything like this in any legislation, so forgive me, because I'd rather analyze and talk about how many pieces of propaganda have been woven into this discussion. But Section 6 is so remarkable that it needs to be at least referenced quickly. It says that from the moment you decide, the Cabinet decides a project is in the national interest, from that moment, every determination and finding that has to be made and every opinion that has to be formed in order for an authorization to be granted in respect of a national interest project is deemed to be made or formed, as the case may be, in favor of permitting the project to be carried out in whole or in part. In other words, the instructions to future decision makers, different ministers, different pieces of legislation, before you look at the evidence, you've got to remember you're exercising your discretion towards getting the project done, regardless of what you find out when you start studying it. So this is the ultimate in leap before you look. As environmental lawyer from West Coast Environmental Law, staff lawyer Anna Johnson said, C-5 tosses aside the notion of informed decision-making, the precautionary principle, and the imperatives of reconciliation, the climate crisis, and democratic decision-making. When you look at a bill like this, you think, we have a parliamentary process for a reason. We have a debate at second reading, and then it goes to committee, and then we hear from witnesses, and then it gets studied, and then you amend it. But everybody's in a hurry. No jobs are going to be saved because we moved too fast to notice that what we were passing was an abomination, that yes, will lead to more court cases, yes, will lead to more delays, but if nothing else, leads to an excess of power in the hands of Cabinet that will never be reversed. And in that, it's an abuse of Parliament itself.
And comments, the Honourable Secretary of State Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Nice to see you up in the chair. First, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague from the Green Party for always raising issues of importance, for being conscious of this place in so many instances, and certainly for being such a stalwart for environmental protection. I think that as is often the case, we get kind of stuck on one idea or one notion, and a couple of words, come to mind, certainly from the Conservative Party. The only kind of idea that they think about when they suggest a project of a national interest is an oil pipeline. But I see lots of other opportunities in this bill. I see wind west. I see an electric grid from coast to coast. I see a corridor for high-speed rail. I see a lot of opportunity here for green infrastructure, for infrastructure that increases our opportunities on renewables, and I thought maybe I'd give the honourable member an opportunity to expound on some of those.
The Honourable Member for Saanich, Gulf Islands.
I thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the question. Surely, and yes, indeed, we support our economy in Canada and we support projects in the national interest. But again, even a really great goal, as I said, the road to hell can be paved with good intentions. We need interties. We need to link our electricity grid east, west, and north, south. Now, suppose you want to link eastern Manitoba with western Ontario, and you decide we really don't need to worry about all those boreal forests and Indigenous rights, and you just railroad right through something where you turn out that you have breached treaty obligations to Indigenous peoples who have trap lines throughout those boreal areas that need to be protected, and siting of electrical grids need to be carefully considered with Indigenous rights in mind.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Northumberland Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Ayn Rand once wrote about the way that socialist societies work is the fact that they create so many regulations that everyone is in violation. And then on the other hand, the government will give you a get-out-of-free card for those individuals who have preference, who benefit from crony capitalism. And that's the way that socialism would work. And so I think this might be actually an area of agreement with this member. Does she believe that either A, that we should just reduce those regulations and let everyone build those projects, or B, we should keep those regulations aware and no one should build those projects?
The Honourable Member for Saanich, Gulf Islands.
I'm going to say something perhaps will shock some. Bill C-69 was an abomination. It continued the Harper process of moving to discretionary project lists instead of the tried and true 40-year experience this country had with federal jurisdiction and the federal government having an obligation to review its own projects under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. That act was working well until spring of 2012 when Harper repealed it. And when he put in place his own act, that was the act that Kinder Morgan was being reviewed under, and that's what caused the delays.
Yes, Your Honour, commentaire.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her speech. I'd like to hear, and this in the light of her vast experience, I believe that you've been observing the government for some years. To your knowledge, is what is being proposed by this government in terms of powers and the risk of weakening environmental protection, have you ever seen anything like this? The Honourable Member.
Le député de Repentigny.
I thank the Honourable Member for Repentigny. It's quite the contrary. I have never seen anything like this. It is the greatest increase in power for the government that I have ever witnessed. It really is incredible.
Our Prime Minister's office seizes more power. The next government seizes more after that. So the things that we decry today as opposition members, whether Liberals in the past now do the things that Liberals used to decry. Conservatives now will decry things that they will expand upon another time if they get.
Questions, comments. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg South Centre, a very brief question.
Tremendous amount of respect for my colleague. The question, however, is in relation to Indigenous rights, which she referenced on a number of occasions. Nothing in the bill that I can see would be able to override constitutional rights for Indigenous communities. Can she elaborate on how it is that she feels that's in jeopardy by virtue of the bill itself? Thank you.
For Saanich Gulf Islands, 15 seconds.
The tautology problem. In order to designate a project in the national interest, you've already denied Indigenous people free, prior, informed consent. It's the way it works. You need a time machine to make this thing work, not to offend the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. As to Section 35 rights, the problem again is that it says there must be a consultation, but it doesn't use the word meaningful consultation.
Order. Pursuant to